Hi and welcome to our presentation about cotton textiles. I'm Sofia and presenting with me today is Erik. The research questions that we will try to answer are the following. Can cotton production be a part of a sustainable society regarding land use? Could conventional cotton production be replaced by organic cotton? Could recycling solve the problem with land demanding cotton cultivation? And lastly, what are the moral problems with cotton production and how could they be solved? In this project, we have looked at the availability of land. This means that we mainly have considered the cultivation and production aspects and not any aspects regarding fabrication, etc. So, what is the difference between organic and conventional cotton? When producing organic cotton, no pesticides or fertilizers are being used. This usually results in lower yields than for conventional cotton, since no pesticides result in greater risks of pests that damage the cotton plant, resulting in more area needed for producing the same amount of material. It is estimated that around 0.1% of global cotton production is organic, so it is still a very uncommon practice. Today, close to 0% of all cotton textiles are being recycled. However, the method that is used when cotton textiles are recycled is mechanical recycling. With this method, up to 20% of a new garment can be recycled material and 80% still needs to be virgin material. A method that could be more relevant in the future is chemical recycling, which could result in higher rates, since this would mean that the fibers would be less affected than when they are torn apart in mechanical ways. In this project, we have both looked at scenarios dealing with 20% recycled cotton material, but we have also explored scenarios with a lot higher rates that possibly could be achieved with future technologies.
Now that you know a little bit about the current state of cotton farming, let's talk about our scenarios. This part is a bit more technical, so listen carefully and try to follow along. We constructed our scenario calculations to show the data for our scenarios over time, up to 50 years from now. At the start of the project, we used a linear increase for our parameters, as seen by the dashed gray line in the top graph. This was later changed to a nonlinear model, with the help of so-called sigmoid curves, which use an exponential function to create graphs like the one shown in blue. Changes in society, especially regarding technologies, often follow these kinds of curves, making our scenarios more realistic. In the bottom figure, you see different types of sigmoid curves. By changing parameters in the function, we can change in the form of the curves. This is seen if you compare the orange and blue curve. We can also change the maximum value and the year that this value is achieved, as seen in the yellow graph, where 50% is reached around the year 2040. Now let's talk about the different parameters we used. The first parameter regards the consumption model and how this will change over time. We use two different types of consumption change. The first one is based on the current yearly percentual increase of cotton production, which is around 2.5%. Using this type of increase creates an exponential curve that doesn't flatten out at the end of our scenarios. The other type of scenario we explored is how the production would change if everyone in the world consumed as much cotton as we do in the Western, highly developed countries. Here, the change occurs according to the sigmoid curves I mentioned earlier, where the current global average was at an SN base. We then let this number increase every year to finally reach a global per capita consumption that is the same as the current consumption in Western countries. The second parameter we introduced was organic farming versus conventional farming. As previously mentioned, the average yield of organic cotton farming is lower than that of conventional farming. The ratio between yields from organic and conventional farming was assumed constant over the time, as data has shown that this has not changed in the last 15 years. The last parameter is the recycling rate, or rather what amount of recycled material that is incorporated in new textiles. Some things to note are that in the scenarios regarding Western consumption, per capita numbers were used. So we used population prediction data from the UN to calculate the total cotton production. Also, the indicator we use for the over time scenarios is the percentage of all arable land that is used for cotton farming. And in our calculations, the total area of arable land is assumed to be constant over time. It's almost time to look at our actual scenarios and calculations. But first, I wanted to show you something interesting that comes from using non-linear models. In the graph to the right, we see how the land use for cotton farming changes over time. The orange and blue lines show the same scenarios, except for recycling rate and what year the given recycling rate is achieved. As you can see, both scenarios reach a maximum of 5% arable land use, but at different times. In the scenario for the blue line, a 70% recycling rate is reached in 2040, while for the orange line, a higher recycling rate of 80% is reached, but not until the year 2070. The fact that both scenarios reach the same maximum value is important, as the years with the highest land use are the most critical. Okay, so we've finally gotten to our actual scenarios. In the graph to the right, the plots show the percentage of arable land needed for cotton farming from the year 2020 to 2070. The table at the top shows how our different scenarios are constructed. The ones where there is a number in the Western year column are the Western consumption scenarios I mentioned earlier, and the ones with no number in this column are the scenarios where a yearly percentual increase is assumed. The other columns show the parameters used in the sigmoid curves for organic farming and for the recycling rates. They each reach a given percentage by the specified year. Let's start by looking at the best and worst case scenarios in terms of land use. As you can see in the graph, the worst case scenario is scenario 1, where we assume a Western consumption with 100% organic farming and no recycling, leading to a sevenfold of cotton land use, which would be completely unsustainable. Scenario 2 is the best case scenario, where we assume a percentual increase with no organic farming and a 50% recycling rate by 2050. As you can see, this scenario barely increases the land use, but due to the exponential consumption growth, we see a continued increase in land use towards the end of the scenario. We also created a kind of in-the-middle scenario, where 50% organic farming and 50% recycling were assumed to be in place by 2070. As you can see, this leads to a relatively low increase in land use. This is mainly due to the using of percentual increase, which leads to much lower production needs than the Western consumption scenarios. We also wanted to examine the possibility of a more ethical scenario, which can be seen as the yellow line for scenario 4. In this scenario, we assume that everyone would have the possibility to consume as much cotton as we do in the West, and that all cotton farming would be organic. We then assumed that the land use wouldn't be allowed to exceed 5% of all arable land, and calculated that this would require an 80% use of recycled material by 2070, something that would likely be very hard to achieve. We also constructed an additional scenario, which can be seen as the light blue line for scenario 5. In this scenario, we assume that current recycling technologies are used and that we reach a recycled material rate of about 20% by 2050, and that the current norm of no organic farming continues. As you might have noticed by now, the scenarios with the highest land use all assume a Western consumption pattern, but within these scenarios there is a wide spread, mainly due to the recycling rates. In the scenarios we've shown you, the indicator percent of arable land was used. To get a better feeling for what this could mean and how an increased land use for cotton farming might compete with other interests, we also compare the maximum land use for 3 of our scenarios with today's land use for cereal production, the total use for cereal, vegetable and fruit production, as well as the total forest area. As you can see in the bar chart, the worst case scenario to the left would require almost a third of the current land use for cereal, vegetable and fruit production to instead be used for cotton farming. This would equate to chopping down over 6% of the world's forests. As you can see, these numbers are way lower for the best case scenario, which is more in line with the current global land use for cotton production. To the right, you see that what we call the ethical scenario would amount to around 10% of the land currently used for cereal production to instead be needed for cotton production. This raises the question of how ethical this scenario actually is, as the increased cotton production would compete with food production in poor countries. It's also important to note that the cotton is not grown all over the world, and so the impact regarding land use could be even higher in some parts.
So, what is the moral problems with cotton production? When it comes to the ethical problems with cotton production, the land use consideration that we touched upon in our scenarios is of course one important aspect. Using a lot of land for cultivation of cotton could of course result in less area reserved for crop production. So, considering the food aspect, it is of course essential to think of whether land should be set aside for conventional or organic cotton production. Another ethical aspect is the question about water consumption, since producing cotton is a highly water demanding activity. However, we will not go into detail regarding this. Another problem is the use of pesticides that will be an issue to consider when producing conventional cotton. In cotton production, as in the production of any material, there are different actors involved with different interests and agendas. Examples are the fashion industry and the big fast fashion brands as for example H&M and Zara, as well as consumers, policymakers and cotton farmers. Cotton production accounts for 16% of the global pesticide release. And taking for example the big cotton exporter India as an example, the pesticide use in the country accounts for 54%. This is even though only 5% of the land under crops in India is used for cotton production. Another fact that indicates the injustice in today's cotton production is the fact that 99% of cotton workers live in developing countries and stand for 75% of the cotton production, at the same time as, for example, North America stands for 25% of the global household cotton product consumption. In countries like India, there are often low levels of safety awareness and lack of access to protective apparatus. On the slide you can see a field which isn't a cotton field, but the picture shows very well how it can look like when the workers are spraying the fields without any protection at all. Keep in mind that many of these chemicals are so poisonous that a single drop absorbed by the skin could kill a human being. Child labor is also often common in many big cotton producing countries, and children are a lot more vulnerable to pesticides than adults. There are of course conflicting interests regarding cotton, and the fashion industry is one strong actor. With the fast fashion trend, meaning low prices and a never-ending flow of new trends, companies can make big money at the same time as the negative effects hits, for example, the farmers in the developing world or the textile workers in poor countries. The product itself has of course positive effects as well, since humans need clothes and textiles, but consumerism that has become more and more widespread because of increased wealth and because of the status connected to consuming, this results in many people buying more than necessary. When discussing future cotton demand, there is a lot of factors that affect the result. Future recycling rates will, for example, depend on how well the collection of old clothes and textiles can be performed, but the constitution of material is also important, since recycling of textile is easiest when consisting of one single material. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, chemical recycling could be important for the future, but is still new and more research is needed. The cotton yields will also be important for the results, which can differ depending on study and region, but also technologies like GMOs could affect the yields. In our scenarios, we partly looked at Western consumption as a model for the future, but it is shown to not be sustainable nor very likely, since it would mean all too excessive demand of land producing cotton if the whole world would consume like us in the developed world. But also looking at food production, that is a conflicting way of using the arable land. This will also depend a lot in the future, depending on, for example, how much meat we eat, how good we become on not wasting food, and also how well we distribute food resources in the world. To conclude, we ask ourselves the question, could cotton be a part of a sustainable society? Organic cotton could be a way to solve some ethical problems regarding, for example, farmers in the developing world being exposed to pesticides. Recycling could instead be a way to minimize land use that in turn is a problem when replacing conventional for organic cotton. However, recycling is technology dependent, and it is also important that we start producing clothes with different material constitutions than today. Lastly, we also conclude that consumption habits need to change, particularly in the developed world, to somewhat distribute the consumption of textiles also to the parts of the world that until now barely have had a chance to consume before. What is important here is that all these three aspects need to be considered. It is not enough that we only do one or two of these adaptations, because then we would have an entirely different outcome. This is of course huge adaptations, and it is not something that is done overnight. That was all that we had to present for you today. Thank you for listening.